The Arrangement. Chapter 1. The Signature. Daniel Rivers signed the contract at 2:47 a.m. in a hotel room that smelled like cigarettes and failure. Not because he'd summoned anything. There were no candles, no incantations, no crossroads at midnight. But because the record executive across from him had made it abundantly clear this was his last chance. The terms were simple. 10 years of his life. Complete creative control surrendered. His image and identity, now property of Apex Entertainment. And in return, everything he'd ever wanted. Fame, money, sold-out stadiums, his face on billboards. The contract didn't mention souls, but Daniel understood what he was signing away. He'd write songs he hated, date people he didn't know, smile for cameras until his face ached, and pretend he wasn't dying inside. He signed his name, and the executive smiled, not warmly, but like a man who'd just acquired valuable property. "Welcome to the family," he said, though it sounded more like a threat than a greeting. That night, in the same hotel room, Daniel had fallen into a sleep so deep it felt like drowning. The dream came immediately, vivid and terrible in its clarity. He was sitting in a diner, red vinyl booths, checkerboard floor, the smell of coffee, and something burning. A man sat across from him, though Daniel couldn't see his face, couldn't quite focus on it, no matter how hard he tried. The man's features seemed to shift and blur, like looking at someone through water. But his voice was crystal clear. It had a quality Daniel had never heard before, like every word contained layers of meaning, like he was explaining the entire architecture of human suffering in casual conversation. The man ordered without looking at the menu. Hot cherry pie and very cold ice cream on a black plate. The waitress nodded, as if this were perfectly normal. The man turned his attention to Daniel then, and though Daniel still couldn't see his face, he felt seen in a way that made his skin crawl. "Congratulations on your decision," the man had said, his voice warm and intimate. "We're going to do wonderful things together." Daniel had woken up sweating, his heart hammering, and told himself it was just stress, just his subconscious processing the enormity of what he'd done. He'd pushed the dream away and focused on the career that was about to explode. That had been 6 years ago, and he'd never thought about that dream again. Until tonight. Chapter 2. The Severance. 6 years later, Daniel had everything the contract promised and nothing he actually wanted. His songs topped charts, but meant nothing. Strangers loved him, but he'd lost everyone who'd known him before. He lived in a mansion that felt like a prison, surrounded by people paid to laugh at his jokes. The worst part wasn't the exhaustion or the emptiness. It was looking in the mirror and seeing a stranger. The real Daniel Rivers, the kid who'd played guitar in his garage and written songs about heartbreak and hope, was gone. In his place stood a brand, a product, a carefully curated illusion that generated billions but felt nothing. He'd check his bank account and feel sick. He'd accept awards and want to scream. The devil didn't need to exist. The industry had done its work perfectly. He'd sold his soul not in a moment of supernatural drama, but in 1,000 small compromises, each one eating away at who he'd been until nothing authentic remained. The breaking point came on the night of his biggest concert, stadium packed, screens broadcasting his face to millions. He was 3 songs in the middle of his biggest hit, when he just stopped singing. The band kept playing for a few bars before trailing off in confusion. 60,000 people stared at him in silence. The screens showed his face in high definition, exhausted, hollow, done. He pulled off his in-ear monitors, set down the microphone with a gentle precision that felt like laying down a weapon, and walked off stage, past security trying to stop him, past his manager screaming about breach of contract, about lawsuits, about career suicide, past photographers and fans, and the entire machinery of his manufactured life. He kept walking until he found himself outside, in the rain, in clothes worth more than most people's cars, with nowhere to go and no one who actually knew him to call. He walked for hours, letting the rain soak through his designer jacket, letting his carefully styled hair plaster to his face, letting the persona dissolve with each step. The city moved around him. Late-night stragglers, homeless people in doorways, delivery trucks making their rounds. And for the first time in years, Daniel felt like he was part of the world instead of performing on top of it. He ended up in a neighborhood he didn't recognize, far from the venues and hotels and penthouses that had become his cage. A diner glowed against the darkness, its neon sign flickering. Rosie's, open 24 hours. It looked like every other diner in America, which made it perfect. Anonymous, real. Daniel pushed through the door, and the bell above it chimed with a sound that felt like absolution. Chapter 3. The Offering. The diner was mostly empty at 3 a.m., a trucker in one corner, a woman who might have been a nurse in another, and a kid with headphones who didn't look up from his phone. Daniel slid into a booth near the back, and a waitress appeared with a coffee pot and the kind of tired smile that came from working the graveyard shift. She poured without asking, and Daniel thanked her with a sincerity that seemed to surprise them both. He drank coffee and sat there, warming his hands on the mug, feeling something he hadn't experienced in 6 years. He felt like himself. Apex Entertainment would sue. He'd lose everything he'd gained. His face would be on tabloids with headlines about breakdowns and career suicide. His management would release statements about exhaustion and mental health, turning his moment of clarity into a PR problem to be managed. But sitting here, in this cheap booth with coffee he'd paid for, with crumpled bills from his pocket, Daniel Rivers felt free. The price of getting his soul back was losing everything he'd sold it for, and that seemed like the best deal he'd ever made. He pulled out his phone and started deleting his social media accounts, watching his carefully curated identity disappear one platform at a time. Then he opened the Notes app and started writing a song, not for an album, not for radio, not for anyone but himself. Words came that meant something, melodies that felt true. He smiled, and it wasn't for cameras or crowds, it was real. That's when he heard the voice. It came from the counter, just across from where Daniel sat. A man's voice, rich and textured, with that same quality, that same impossible quality, of containing more meaning than the words themselves should hold. Like every syllable was a door opening onto something vast and terrible. Hot cherry pie and very cold ice cream, the voice said to the waitress, on a black plate. Daniel's hand froze over his phone. The coffee cup slipped slightly, hot liquid splashing onto the table. His heart, which had been calm for the first time in years, began to hammer against his ribs, because he knew that voice. He knew that exact order. He knew, with a certainty that bypassed logic and went straight to primal recognition, what was about to happen. The memory crashed over him like a wave. The hotel room 6 years ago, falling into that drowning sleep. The dream of sitting in a diner exactly like this one. The man whose face he couldn't see, but whose voice he could never forget. The same order, the same words, the same terrible intimacy in the tone, like the speaker knew every secret Daniel had ever kept, every desire he'd ever hidden, every weakness he'd tried to bury. Daniel looked up slowly, his body moving against his will, drawn by the inevitability of it. The man was sitting at the counter, his back to Daniel, wearing a perfectly ordinary suit that somehow seemed too perfect, too carefully tailored to appear normal. He was talking to the waitress with easy charm, making her laugh at something Daniel couldn't hear. But even from behind, there was something wrong about him, something that made the air feel thicker, made the fluorescent lights seem dimmer, made every sound in the diner feel muffled and distant. The waitress set down a plate, black as requested, with a slice of cherry pie, red as blood, and a scoop of vanilla ice cream already melting at the edges. The man thanked her with a voice like honey and turned, plate in hand, to survey the diner. His eyes found Daniel immediately, as if he'd known exactly where to look, as if this entire performance had been choreographed specifically for an audience of one. Daniel saw his face, and something in his mind tried to reject what he was seeing. The man looked completely ordinary, middle-aged, pleasant features, the kind of face you'd forget 5 minutes after seeing it. But underneath that ordinariness was something else, something that Daniel's hindbrain recognized, even if his conscious mind couldn't articulate it. The eyes were wrong, too knowing, too old, too amused by private jokes that stretch back to the beginning of time. The man smiled, and it was the warmest, most genuine smile Daniel had ever seen. It was also the most terrifying. "Daniel Rivers," he said, and his voice turned Daniel's name into a secret between them. "Congratulations on your moment of clarity. That took courage. Most people never find the strength." He walked over to Daniel's booth, moving with a grace that seemed too fluid, too deliberate, like every step had been rehearsed for maximum effect. "Mind if I join you? I promise I'm better company than your phone." Daniel wanted to run. Every instinct screamed at him to get up, to flee, to put as much distance between himself and this man as possible. But his body wouldn't move. It wasn't that he was paralyzed. It was that some part of him, some deep and terrible part, wanted to stay, wanted to hear what this man had to say, wanted to know what was being offered in the palm that would inevitably open. "I know you," Daniel managed, his voice barely above a whisper. "From the dream, the night I signed." The man's smile widened, showing perfect teeth. "Yes, I wanted to introduce myself properly then, but the timing wasn't right. You needed to make your choice freely, without interference. That's how these things work, you see. Free will is the entire point of the exercise." He set his plate down and slid into the booth across from Daniel, with the casual ease of an old friend. "I'm usually called many things, but you can call me Mr. Morningstar if you need a name. Though names are such limiting things, don't you think?" The diner sounds, the sizzle of the grill, the murmur of other patrons, the clatter of dishes, seemed to fade into white noise. It was as if a bubble had formed around their booth, isolating them from the rest of the world. Daniel could still see the other people, but they seemed distant, irrelevant, like extras in a scene focused entirely on the two actors at this table. "You're not real," Daniel said, but it sounded like a question. Mr. Morningstar laughed, a sound so genuinely delighted that it made Daniel's skin crawl. "Oh, I'm quite real. Just not in the way you're used to thinking about reality. But that's philosophy, and philosophy is boring." He picked up his fork and cut into the pie with surgical precision. "Let's talk about you instead. about this charming little rebellion you've just staged, walking off your own concert, deleting your life. Very dramatic, very brave, very temporary. What do you mean, temporary? I mean, Mr. Morningstar said, taking a bite of pie and ice cream together, savoring it with obvious pleasure. That freedom is wonderful, until you remember what it costs. Right now, you're high on adrenaline and righteousness. You feel pure, authentic, real. It's intoxicating, isn't it? Being yourself again? He leaned forward slightly, and his eyes, those too old, too knowing eyes, fixed on Daniel with an intensity that felt like being X-rayed. But tomorrow, the lawsuits start. Next week, your money dries up. Next month, you're sleeping on a friend's couch if you have any friends left. Next year, you're working a day job, and the music that felt so pure tonight feels like a hobby you can't afford. And in 5 years, you're nobody, and being yourself doesn't seem quite so valuable anymore. Daniel's jaw tightened. That's the price. I'm willing to pay it. Are you? Mr. Morningstar's smile never wavered. That's what everyone says in the moment. But the moment passes, Daniel. It always does. And then you're left with consequences, and consequences are so much heavier than principles. He took another bite, letting the silence stretch. The contract you signed 6 years ago, the one with Apex Entertainment, do you know what it really was? What you were really agreeing to? It was a record deal. It was an invitation, a test, a way of seeing if you were willing to trade authenticity for achievement. And you were. Enthusiastically. You didn't need me to make you compromise yourself, Daniel. You did that all on your own. That's the beautiful thing about free will. I don't have to force anyone to do anything. I just have to provide options and what you choose. Daniel felt something cold spread through his chest. So you're saying I did this to myself? I'm saying you're human. Humans are magnificent creatures, really, so full of potential, so capable of greatness, and so utterly predictable in how they destroy themselves. You want things, success, recognition, love, meaning, and you're willing to do almost anything to get them. The trick is that almost, that little sliver of conscience that makes you feel like you're still a good person, even as you make choices that hollow you out from the inside. Mr. Morningstar finished his pie and pushed the plate aside. You signed that contract because you wanted what it promised, more than you wanted to remain yourself. That's not evil. That's just human nature. My job isn't to corrupt you. It's to offer you exactly what you want and let you corrupt yourself.